everyone, welcome back to Liz Sews. When I shared my April sewing plans, a lot of you guys were interested in this 8513 pattern from Simplicity, and that is the bodysuits. I think this is definitely on trend, especially with the resurgence of 90s fashion, and this pattern offers a lot of great different options. I'm particularly drawn to view C, which is the wraparound version. So fairly soon after April started, I went to work and got that sewn up. Unfortunately, I made a very major mistake on my seam allowances, and this is completely unwearable. So I thought I would give it a go again since most of you were interested in it, and what follows is just a sew along with me as I make the version that I am wearing now. So let's get started.
Okay, so now for your supplies. You're going to need fabric, a pattern. I like to just use a tissue on some of these cheaper patterns because they're so cheap I can just buy a new one. Pins to fasten your pattern to your fabric. Then you have scissors for cutting it out. For finishing off the legs, you're going to need some 1/4 inch woven elastic. And then I will be using some spring snaps that I have that work with my rivet press, but you can use whatever snaps you can find at your local sewing store. And that is to attach the crotch portion. And then in addition to this, I have a couple other extra things that I liked with this pattern. I have just this stabilizing tape, which normally I use when I put in zippers, but I put this again in that crotch area where the snaps are going to be, just to help stabilize that a little bit better. I also have a double-sided wash away tape, and that's going to be helpful when I'm making the neckline because I will be doing view C. And I think that should be enough to get it started. So now we are going to cut out the pattern. So the first thing you want to do is iron all of your pattern pieces. I just take my iron on a really low setting with no steam and press them out just to sort of get rid of some of that creases, and then I'll help you get it truer to size. Now when we're talking about size, if you measure yourself based on the pattern envelope, let's see, I came out to be a size 16 with these measurements. So a bust of 36 to 38, a waist of 28 to 30, and a hip of 38 to 40. So that puts me in a medium. Then I would go and I would check the pattern pieces themselves. So this pattern only has the bust size marked. It doesn't have any of the waist, but you can see that if I look at a medium, and it has a 33-inch bust, which is pretty tiny. As you remember, a medium was supposed to measure a 36 to 38. But the reason that this is 33 is because it is a knit garment. You're gonna want some negative ease. You're gonna want it to be sort of tight around your body. So I'm gonna go ahead and use that medium size. If you wanted something a little bit more relaxed, you could always go one size up, and that would be a lot sort of like baggier fit. But I kind of like the way it is on the pattern cover, so I'm going to stick with the medium that it suggested. So now I have everything pinned onto my fabric except for my neck bands right there. The reason I do this is because I tend to buy fabric without a specific pattern in mind, and so I might not necessarily have everything, that all the fabric that the pattern calls for. So this way I can just make sure if everything is pinned down that I have enough. So this has very few pieces. You have these two are going to make up your front piece. It looks like a wrap top, but it actually is a faux wrap. Then there is a lining piece right there. Here we have the back piece, which I think is really unique about this pattern, is it does have this sort of curve in on the waist and gives you a little bit more room on the bottom and up at the top, which it's kind of annoying that you have a center back seam, but I think the shaping gives you a really nice effect. And then last we have the sleeve piece. So one thing I'm going to do right now, which may seem a little bit unorthodox, is to put in my pattern markings, so like my dots and stuff. Just because this fabric that I'm working with is an ITY, and it will roll up once you cut the sides, and then it can be a little bit difficult to be super accurate with that. So I find that it works out better if I do that now before I cut it out. So the way that I do this generally is to sink a pin into that mark. It's really difficult to do with only one hand. Then I will take, I'm using just a friction pen, and sort of lift up the pattern piece, and then mark where that pin has been sunk. So I'm just going to go around and do that on all of my pattern pieces now. So here we have everything cut out, also my neckbands. In addition to all the pattern pieces, I also cut out 2 additional rectangles, which I'm going to use as cuffs in the bottom of my sleeve, just because I prefer that finish to rolling up the hem and seaming it. And to make the cuffs, you just want to cut a piece that is exactly the width of the bottom of the arm, and then it's going to be folded. So I've cut mine as a 3-inch long when it's folded, and then you get 1.5 inches, and then I'm going to sew it into there with probably a 1/2 inch or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, which will give me a 1-inch cuff on the end. If sleeve length is always a problem for you, this is a great way to lengthen the sleeve without having to alter the pattern itself. However, if you have to frequently shorten your sleeves, then I definitely would account for that and know that this will add an extra length to your sleeve. Okay, so I have set up my machine with a jersey needle. I've also seen this referred to as a ballpoint needle. And then just make sure it doesn't snag the fabric. And then I've put my polyester thread in the top and the bottom bobbin. For most of my sewing, I will be using a zigzag stitch. And with knits, I like to go through a pass of zigzag on my sewing machine and then finish it with the cover stitch or serger. And I just find that I have a lot more control on the sewing machine, so that's my preference. But if you think you can do it all in one go on the serger, you know, go ahead. So we will be doing view C, and the directions for view C will start out on page 4 of the directions. Now, one thing I want to say, I want you to learn from my mistakes, is that if you looked on page 1 of the directions, it says that everything will be a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, unless otherwise noted. So when I did this bodysuit for the first time, I saw that and I'm like, okay, so I started sewing at 5/8, and it never mentioned another seam allowance in the directions for view C. Now, if you look on page 2 of the directions, and we have just general tips and tricks for sewing with knits, and if you get to the bottom of that, you will see that the seam allowance is actually 3/8 of an inch and not 5/8 of an inch. So the first time I made this bodysuit, I did everything with 5/8 of an inch, and it did not fit, not surprisingly, because I had taken almost 1.5 inches off of the circumference. So make sure you sew everything with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. First step is to stitch the center back seam of back 3. So that's going to be the 2 back pieces that we cut that had that nice curve on them. And we're also going to sew together at the shoulder seams the 2 front pieces to the back piece as well. And then finally, we're going to take the bottom edge, turn it to the inside twice, and sew it. Okay, so we have the back piece pinned together along that center back seam. I put it into my sewing machine with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I have my walking foot on, and this is very helpful when you're doing knits, just to make sure that nothing is stretching and moving out of place. And I just have my standard zigzag stitch set. Okay, so now that I have this back seam done, I bring it over to my serger, and I like to line it up. You can see that like these 2 marks are where the 2 needles come in, and I've actually used a Sharpie marker to just make a little dot to the to the left of that, and that is where I like to like line up my stitching. So I don't really want the serging to be the finished line of stitching. I just want to have it there as a backup and to give it some extra durability. Now you can just sew this on the serging machine. I tend not to do that because I find it really hard to use these seam allowance markings. So I like to sew in the sewing machine and then finish with a serger instead. So now that we have the back finished up, you lay it down with right sides up, and then we will pin in the two front pieces along the shoulder seams. So as I'm sewing up my shoulder seams, I'm going to put in this clear elastic. I think I just got this off of Amazon. If you search for clear elastic, you should be able to find it, and it's like a 1/4 inch. And you will see this in most ready to wear knit garments, and this just helps on the shoulder seam to stabilize it and just make it a little bit better so that it won't bag out or get stretched out over time. So you can see I still have it connected to the card, and I just put it in the center of my presser foot and just sew on top of it along that seam. Okay, so here we have the shoulder seam. You can see that clear elastic is just in there, and then my serging thread is going right through where my zigzag stitches are. So the last part of step 1 is to fold up the back of the crotch extension. So it's going to be, the back is the one that has this seam in it. And this is where the stabilizing tape is going to come in. So you see I've pressed in just a little bit. This should be about 1/4 inch. It's not exact, it's not a big deal. And I will take this stabilizer, seam stabilizer, and put it right where that fold is. And then we're going to fold it one more time, so it's completely encased inside of there. Okay, so I've sewn that into place. I ended up using a straight stitch just because this is not an area that's going to need to stretch. And I also sewed again close to the folded edge just because I thought it would help look it a little neater. And if I give this a nice pull and tug, that seems really stable. It's not going anywhere. So this is looking perfect. So now moving on to step 2, it says stitch right neckband 15 to left neckband 16 at center back seam. Fold in half lengthwise with wrong sides together, having raw edges even, and press. Okay, so I have finished step 2. You can see we just sew these together on a notched side using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. This one you could probably do straight. You don't have to necessarily do a zigzag there because I don't really expect that seam to have to stretch. And then I have pressed it in half, the outsides out. Now, all of those dots that you put into the pattern pieces are really going to be helpful here because it's going to help you line up where certain sections of these things are going to match up. The neckband will be at a slight tension compared to the bodysuit, and that is so that the neckband stands up straight and doesn't roll to the outside. So you want to match up all your dots and pin them into place. Okay, so I have the neckband all pinned in, and it's going to extend all the way on that longer front piece to the shoulders, around the back of the neck, crossing over to the second front piece. And the directions say to stitch this, you want to do 3/8 inch and then another 1/4 inch away from that. But because I'm going to serge, I'm going to skip that second line of stitching. So just like we did with the back seam, I'm going to stitch it at 3/8 inch and then serge it to finish off the edge and strengthen that seam. Now, as I said, the neckband is slightly smaller than the garment itself, so while you're sewing you will need to put just a little bit of tension on it like this so that the two pieces are laying flat against each other. So you can see my line of zigzag stitching, and then I followed it up with serging instead of a second line. And then I've just pressed this out so the folded edge of the neckband is facing out. And you can see on the other side of the fabric how it just makes this nice edge along the neck. It looks really nice and finished and clean. So moving on in the directions, we are at step 4 now, where it says press seam towards bodysuit. So we've done that. Pressing band out. Fold right neck band down to expose the seam allowance with right sides together. Pin left front over right neckband, matching large dots, having raw edges even, stitch. Okay, that sounds really complicated, but it's actually not that hard to do. Okay, so I have the back of my piece facing up towards me. Then I'm going to bring down the larger of the front piece. And then we're just sort of gonna line it up underneath that arm and at the hip. Good idea of where it's going to be. Lined it up at this hip down here as well, and that's going to give us a good idea of where it's going to cross over on the front. The reason you want this one to come down first is this is what's going to show on the top on the outside. Next, we're going to take the smaller piece and we just want to attach it right where it connects to the larger piece. Now, the directions say to pin it, and I didn't think that turned out very well. I thought that using this double-sided washable tape is a lot easier, and I think it gives you a lot cleaner finish on this. So it's just a double-sided tape. So the first thing I do, just to get an idea of how long I need it to be, so I need the tape to come all the way up to there. So I will just lay this tape down along that serged edge. Okay. This just has a paper backing, so we can pull the paper backing off. And then what we are left with is just the sticky part of the tape right there. So I want to line up my piece. So you want to make sure you have a continuous line on the side. And then just stick that down. So this is what it'll look like from the outside. So now we're just going to do some top stitching. We're going to start at this low corner of the hip where that neckband ends. And you want to do it about like 1/8 of an inch down from where the neckband is. And we're going to sew up here all the way around the neck, swooping back and end at that V. And that will keep this taped spot secure, and so when you wash it and the tape goes away, it's all good. So here I have it set up on my machine. I'm going to use a straight stitch to top stitch around here, but you could also use like a twin needle, which will give you a line of stitching on either side. I like to line up the seam of my neckband right on the inner portion of my presser foot, and that gives me about 1/8 of an inch. So I'm just going to sew this all the way up, and this is the section right now which we have taped. So after your top stitching, you should have something that looks like this. You can see this neckband extends all the way around and then doubles back to this nice V. So our next step is going to be to stitch up the front and back at the side seams. So I'm just going to flip this back around with the right sides facing each other and then just sew up both of those sides with a zigzag stitch. Okay, so I have just done up these side seams, just like I've done before, with a line of zigzag stitching and then a line of overlocking. So now the directions say to continue to bodysuit A 7 through 13. 7. With right sides together, pin crotch lining to front, matching center fronts and having raw edges even. Stitch notch edge together, trim seam. Okay, so we're going to find our crotch, and this is the front. The front does not have a seam running down the center of it. And we're going to take that right sides up, and you're going to take our lining piece, and you should have a narrow end and then a slightly wider end. So the narrow end is what is going to go up here. So just going to pin that in place. So once you have that lining sewn into place, you want to flip it around to the inside. I would give this a good press right here. And then we're just going to want to baste this in place along the edge. And to baste, you just want to use your straight stitch as long as it will go. So in my case, that's 5 millimeters. So now we have the crotch lining piece that I have just turned around to the inside and basted into place. Next step is number 9. It says cut 2 pieces of elastic the length of the leg opening guide. On inside, pin elastic to leg with edges even. And I'm going to go along on the outside of the fabric, just putting a little bit of tension on the elastic and sew that with the zigzag stitch. Then once that is done, I will fold it in twice and sew again with a line of zigzag stitching. So here it is on the machine. You see the elastic is just on the edge of the right side of the fabric, and I'm sewing a zigzag down the center of the elastic. Okay, so on this side you can see I've done the first step, which is to apply the elastic just to the outside of the fabric. And the other side I've gone ahead and finished it off, and that means that you need to fold the elastic in twice and then sew it again. And that way you don't have that nasty elastic touching your skin, you just have the nice fabric and it still has a lot better recovery. So what we're going to do over here is fold it once and then fold it one more time. And I don't bother using pins for this. It just, once you get it started, it should be fairly easy. And then you just sew that in place with a zigzag stitch. So the last step is going to be the sleeves. So you want to take your sleeves and then fold them with right sides together, and we're going to stitch along the long side to form the sleeve. So the last step is to ease the sleeves into the armhole. And if you've ever eased sleeves in with wovens, this is a lot easier. So we want to take the sleeve, we want the right side facing out, and then I sort of put it inside of the armhole, and I will match up my seam along the bottom. And you should have some markings on the sleeve itself. So the center marking, that's going to line up with the shoulder seam. Then we have another mark that aligns up with a mark that is on there. So when you're sewing this, you just sort of have to like stretch it so that they both lie flat, because otherwise the armhole is just a little bit wider. Or rather, the sleeve tends to be a little bit longer than the armhole itself. And when you're doing with wovens, you have to be really careful to sort of like scooch it in so you don't get any tucks, but since there is enough stretch in this fabric, it is very easy to just stretch it so that they fit. I'm just going to sew this in with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance with a zigzag stitch, finish it with an overlocker, and then we are done with the sewing portion. All we have to do is put in our snaps. So here we have the sleeve that's been put in. You can see I've done a line of got a line of stitching, zigzag in there, and then serged, and when you pull it around to the outside, it should look like that. So we are done with sewing. The final step in our bodysuit is to put these snaps in, and I will be using a rivet press, which I purchased when I started doing bags, and I'm going to need 2 different dies. This is the first set of dies, and that will go with the sort of domed top and then the female part of the snap. And then the second set of dies I have, and you see there's a pin in one and then sort of like a hole in the other one. And that is going to go with the male part of the snap and the backing. I like to make my holes all at the same time. So I will just line up the pieces where they will overlap. And I will take an awl, and I'm going to put probably 2 snaps in here. So I just sort of work my way in, poke it through. So then you take your piece of fabric. This is the bit, the domed bit is what is going to be facing the outside, and you just push that through the hole you've made. And then the female part of the snap, we'll slide over top of that. And then you just sort of line that up onto the press and then go down. It doesn't take very much pressure at all. Then you need to change out the dies when you go to do the other side. So I like to do all of one at once, and then I change them out and do the rest. Kind of just want to do a double check. So again, you want to have the domes on the outside, and then this is going to be on the inside. So you want to make sure that your post is coming through the wrong side of the fabric to the right side. And then okay, so that is it.
I hope you guys have enjoyed the sew along, and I can't wait to see you again next time. Take care.